and the land of Kett's Rebellion and Burston and the Fakenham shoe workers occupation and so on. I think we probably need something to cheer us up. So talking about the future social society is a good way to start the year. The COVID pandemic has put into sharp relief all the things that make us angry about the world. The money grabbing of the rich, the huge levels of discrimination, the hollowing out of public services. And in this situation, very often the things that people want are sort of quite defensive in nature. So the demands of the People for Profit programme emphasise defending jobs, creating safe workplaces, and this week, very importantly, just opening the schools on a limited basis to keep people safe, a move which was successful. These sort of defensive demands to keep what we've got in a way are really important because they relate to people's everyday experience and they have a very big mobilising power. But the emergency programme also hints at a more radical transformation of society with its demand for public ownership and a green investment programme. But revolutionary socialists are never satisfied. We always want a bit more. And further back in time, socialists would come up with quite grand plans, utopias for the future, which on one occasion included a lemonade sea, not something that we would demand now, not least because of environmental grounds. But nonetheless, having a big picture is something that's quite important. But sometimes these big pictures can seem a bit distant, but fortunately we can fuse the struggles of today with those of the past, because those struggles have often thrown up very good embryonic examples of what can be done. They don't limit our imagination, but they do give it a very firm footing. My starting point about the future social society, though, is this. For most of the time, most people live in one sort of fear, if you like, fear of the boss, fear of the police. We mainly do what we're told at work, for example. Now, this is partly because we don't control the economic levers of power, but also because from a very early age, we're told to know our place in society, not to be uppity, all those sort of expressions that surround us, that there are natural rulers and we're very definitely not part of that group. And so I think perhaps the most important thing about previous revolutionary upsurges is that people no longer knew their place. They were prepared to challenge the people who were supposedly above them and their betters. Now, very often we refer to examples from overseas. It's the French who are revolutionary. We don't do that sort of thing in England. It's not British and so on. But actually, in this country, we've got a very good tradition. I don't apologise for going back to the years 1640 to 1649, when in this country and the old feudal order was ramming up against an emerging capitalist order. And what this meant is that thousands and thousands of people were thrown into struggle against the existing rulers. And what that meant is that all the relations of that society became questioned. And there's one really good example I love that comes from this time. In 1648 in London, the Earl of Middlesex was on a booze up, if you like, really, in an upper room in a pub in London. And as they did in those days, they would pee into a chamber pot, and the Earl of Middlesex then chucked the contents out of the window, whereupon it fell upon some foot soldiers below. These would be soldiers of the new model army at the time. Now, normally, foot soldiers would just take this sort of thing, but not in those days. They began to challenge the order. So the foot soldiers shouted up, hurled abuse back at the Earl of Middlesex, who then threatened to throw the chamber pot down on them. Whereupon the foot soldiers drew their swords, charged upstairs, and arrested the Earl of Middlesex. Now, the publican called for help for the Earl of Middlesex, but unfortunately for the Earl of Middlesex, the soldiers that arrived then promptly arrested the said Earl. Now, this is a fantastic event, I think, a real event where the world is literally turned upside down, as the phrase actually from the Bible went at the time. But knowing our place, not knowing our place, becomes a force of habit when people are fighting back. And very often the people who stop knowing their place are people who are the most oppressed in society previously. And this is especially true of women in our society. Again, I use an example from the English Revolution, not just because it's so revolutionary, but the language is actually beautiful as well. It's just like reading Shakespeare putting the Russian Revolution on stage, if you like. And this example comes from 1649, when Oliver Cromwell had 4 levellers arrested. The levellers were the extreme left of the English Revolution, and 4 of them were arrested. Whereupon the women of the City of London gathered a petition, about 20,000 signatures, but they didn't just hand it in. Hundreds of them marched to the House of Commons, and this is what they said. They said, "We are so overpressed, so overwhelmed in affliction, that we are not able to keep our compass, to be bound by the custom of our sex." I mean, I just think that's beautiful, isn't it? We are not able to keep our compass, to keep to the course that you've set us. Whereupon the House of Commons said to them, "Go home and look after your own business and meddle with huswifery," as they said, i.e. go back home and do the housework. Well, the women weren't taking that either. So they organised another petition, marched again, and said, "Have we not equal interest with the men of this nation? We will never cease to importune you." They wouldn't stop. They wouldn't know their place. And I think when people begin to say that, everything becomes possible. And of course, women have done it throughout revolutionary periods, and it's opened up a vision of what is possible. In 1871, for example, the workers and inhabitants of Paris took over the city for quite a lengthy period of time to stop it being taken over by the Prussians and also by the members of their own ruling class who had thrown their lot in with the Prussians. And the women demanded freedom to divorce. These sort of demands were also raised in 1917 in revolutionary Russia, where women won equal pay, maternity rights, marriage as a free and voluntary institution, plus communal kitchens, a kind of version of eat out to strike out version. And very interestingly, also prostitution was decriminalised, and prostitutes set up cooperatives where they could retrain, get healthcare and things like this. This is, miles ahead of anything that we even see in this country today. But importantly, it's not just women whose lives can be changed by a new society and by the struggles for that new society. It also happens to victims of racism. Russia was a really deeply anti-Semitic society, but Jewish people became elected to lead really important Soviets, workers' councils throughout the country. And in 1917, there was a Congress of Muslim peoples, which had 1,000 delegates. 200 of them were women, and they voted to abolish polygamy and Purdah. And there's another group, I think, and this is fascinating, is today, I think we're probably a little bit more aware, although the government singly does very little about it, is about the extent of mental distress in this country. You know, it's a serious problem which has become even worse in the current situation. Similar levels of mental distress happened during the First World War, when millions of soldiers, thousands and thousands of soldiers, suffered from what they called shell shock at the time. And in Germany, they established neurosis stations to treat these people. But Germany too, in the years 1917, 1918, was hit by a revolutionary wave. And that revolutionary wave hit a town called Mergentheim, where there was one of these neurosis stations. And one of the doctors said that many of their patients, on becoming involved in the revolution, shed their symptoms and became revolutionary leaders. People with mental stress, instead of being victims, instead of lacking control, suddenly began to exert control. And I think that's a really important thing to happen to people in those situations. Now, the key to all this, these sort of changes, is struggle, obviously, but mass active democratic participation and involvement. And very often in revolutionary times, this takes the forms of workers' councils, workers' soviets, different names in different parts of the world at different times, but a phenomenon that is repeated. Institutions that are set up to run a strike, run a factory, then begin to emerge that can run a whole country. And what this does is it begins to challenge the world of work. Let me take one example, for example, night work. The TUC did a survey 2 years ago that showed that 3 million people in this country work nights. Now, some of that is unavoidable, people working in hospitals and so on. But a lot of it is just because the bosses want to keep the machines going, to make the best out of their investment so they keep the pennies rolling in, if you like. In the Paris Commune that I mentioned of 1871, one of the first acts of the Commune was to abolish night work for bakers. Now, can you imagine the horror of wealthy British tourists in Provence going to the bakery to get their baguette early in the morning to find that it's not available because the bread shop was closed that night? I mean, I think this is a really important institution there, but they did it, and they did it in 1871. In Moscow in 1917, there was a very important metalworks. And the sort of things that they did there transformed the workplace from a place where you went to be exploited to a place where you could live and develop. So they demanded and got cafeterias in every workshop. So I mean, it's incredibly liberating for people who had to go back and cook in appalling conditions. But they also demanded that every workshop had a meeting place for lectures and cultural events. So you went to work and then you participated in a process of joint education and learning and growing together. Can you imagine any real workplace doing that instead of the dull training sessions that you go through so that you can do your job better for the boss? This, I think, blows the lid on what work can be like. And the same sort of thing happens in schools. Schools, obviously, incredibly important. We've had a massive argument, obviously, about whether they should be open, but also with the question of exams. I mean, the Tories may think they're advanced getting rid of exams, but really this happened a long time ago. And it happened most famously in 1968 in Paris. The lycées in Paris, on the back of a massive student workers movement where there's huge occupations and strikes across the country, pupils began to take over their schools. They dragged the teachers along with them. And the schools would typically start the day with a meeting of meetings of the students and the teachers to decide what the daily studies would be, who would introduce a subject, what books would be used, and so on. And critically, exams were abolished, and there was continuous assessment instead by the teachers, but also, quote, by comrades of the work team. Comrades of the work team. That meant other pupils. So instead of being pitted up against other pupils so the exams could sort you into relevant classes, I mean social classes, not school classes, you had pupils working together to help each other out. Now, that spirit of cooperation in a future social society is incredibly important. We wouldn't have Big Pharma competing against each other for a race to produce a vaccine which they could sell more vials of to make more money. We wouldn't have any of that. But I think the spirit of cooperation would go deeper than that. We're very used to see sporting events which are enormously competitive and they become patriotic and it's xenophobic and so on. But actually there is an alternative to that. The one I like best is in 1914, people will be familiar with the Christmas truce. It wasn't a truce, it was a wholesale mutiny by soldiers, English and German, who refused to fight anymore, Welsh and Scottish, etc. as well. And most famously, they played football in between the trenches in no man's land. Now, this gets transcribed by the modern day papers as being an early version of the England versus Germany football match in 1966. So they replay that. But actually, when you read the accounts of the time, scores weren't kept. This was sport for pleasure, to get to know people, to keep fit, to make friends. And I think that says a lot about the sort of future exercise and recreation that we would like. We're quite low about futures of society, low, however, without thinking about the environment. COVID takes place against a huge climate crisis. In last year, 12 million people in India, Nepal and Bangladesh had to flee their homes because of flooding. 12 million. I live in New York. We're quite used to flooding. I know you had some flooding in Norfolk lately, but in a bad flood, we'll have 300 or 400 having to move. But this is 12 million people, and so the need to stop the rift between humans and nature, which is so destructive, is vital. And the sort of world that I would like to live in, it goes like this. I live quite close to the centre of York, so my daily exercise is to walk out about 2.5 miles outside of York. That's fine, 5 more minutes, it's fine. So I walk about 2.5 miles out of York. And there's a site of special scientific interest, a heathland. And in May, I could go there and early in the morning and listen to snipe drumming. Now, I hope all good Norfolk, Suffolk people know what a snipe is, a small wading bird with a fairly long bill. In the early hours of the mornings in spring, you can see them fly up, go around in a circle and then dive down. It's a mating ritual. And as they dive down, they open their tail feathers and the wind going through their tail feathers makes a whoop, 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 whoop noise. Now that's not a brilliant impersonation, Google it. But it is the most beautiful sound in the world. Actually, one place you can hear it, if you go into the East Anglian Film Archive and look up a film called A Man Between Three Rivers. It's an Anglo television film, which my dad was the cameraman on. It's an absolutely beautiful film, and there's a clip of wildfowl, and you can hear the snipe drumming there. It's beautiful. Now, I think that is a glorious experience, but my problem is this. To get to this site, I have to walk through a private golf club, which charges £70 a round and which drenches the Greens with all sorts of unhealthy things which undermine nature. The sort of world that I would like to see is that we don't have that golf club. We have open natural land that people can enjoy. And indeed, more than that, that we break the barrier between town and country so that fingers of countryside are immersed within the cities, where people can enjoy nature and enjoy people's company without having to get into a car and without having to go to a piece of the countryside which is actually turned into a commodity which you buy and an entry ticket for. That's the sort of world I would like to live in. But I'll just conclude with this. We are surrounded all the time with ridiculous pictures of luxury consumption, perfume adverts at Christmas, the pub that lands on a Caribbean island shoreline for a national lottery advert, ridiculous aspirations to what we should look like. But we should, and what I've emphasised is that in creating the future society, social society, it comes out of the struggles that we engaged in. But we should also remember this, that for most people, struggle takes on a different meaning. For most people, struggle, for millions and billions of people around the world, there is a struggle just to put food on their plate, to have somewhere, a roof over their head. And in one sense, what we want to do is to end that struggle, the struggle of daily existence. William Morris, who was a brilliant end of 19th century socialist, artisan, designer, writer, he had to do a very similar meeting to this once on the future socialist society. And he wrote a book called News from Nowhere, which hopefully a few of you have read. It's a beautiful book. But basically, the central character leaves the socialist meeting, goes home, falls asleep, and wakes up in a future socialist society, traveling around the society as he goes. And he meets two of the inhabitants of this new socialist society. And the inhabitants of the new socialist society say to him this: "We have been living for 150 years at least, more or less in the present manner, and a tradition or habit of life has been growing on us. And that habit has become a habit of acting on the whole for the best. It is easy for us to live without robbing each other. It would be possible for us to contend with and rob each other, but it would be harder for us than from refraining from strife and robbery. This, in short, is the foundation of our life and happiness." I think that is the sort of society that we would all like to live in, and one worth fighting for. Yeah, thanks. That was just absolutely brilliant discussion with some fantastic points. I'll try and address as many as I can without it being taking us into the next lockdown, perhaps. I think it was Bertolt Brecht that said, communism is that easy thing, so hard to achieve. And there's a real truth in that. And part of the reason why it's true is because the society that we live in creates so much potential and opportunities and knowledge, but it is completely wasted because it's based on exploitation of a vast majority of the population to create profits for a few. So all that potential is wasted, and that goes into every field talk about. So schools was mentioned. Fascinating that Catherine been to Summerhill, because Summerhill was on the go when I was at school. I wish if I'd have been to Summerhill, perhaps I would have had a more successful school career, but there you go. So that was brilliant. But schools, you see, I mean, your everyday experience of young children is they want to explore and learn. They love exploring, they love knowing things. My great-granddaughter, they sent me a video of her going through my first bird book, and at 3.5, I was so chuffed when she could name every bird, you know, including the great crested grebe and things like that. I mean, that wanting to know is driven out of people, because the purpose of education under this society is to teach us as much as we need to know to be exploited, and to make sure we know our place. And it's easy to overturn that, because we go back to it being about the children who want to know, and going with the flow on that, and teachers being able to enable that, and not forcing things down people's throats, because that's not how they want to learn, and indeed that's not how they learn in the first place. Tim talked a bit about money. You see, money in this society is a representative form of all the labour that we've ordinary people have performed over years and years. It takes an artificial form that then has power over us, but it's a very real power. And all these financial instruments may seem very abstract and so on, but when it comes down to it, when there's a subprime mortgage back in a crisis in 2008, all these fancy financial instruments means that people get evicted from their homes. That's the power it has over us. And so I've no doubt that money will take a completely different form in a socialist society. And indeed, as Mark said, we would abolish the money system, emphasis on the system there, the whole thing that upholds that as something that is held over us. Mike made a point about technology and about William Morris. I remember back in the 1980s, a Labour MP wrote a ridiculous book called The End of Work. What he's saying is that new technology would mean that everything would be so easy to do that we wouldn't have to work as hard. And that actually, new technology has meant that most people in this country are working longer weeks. The work that they do is more alienated to them. They don't have the control. The joy of work has gone out of it for everything. Every little thing you do is broken down into such small parts. You can't possibly enjoy doing it. Someone else wants to finish, ask the question. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but I think it's Jim who wanted to ask a question. I know I'm cutting right across everything, but I got a text message, and okay. Otherwise it wouldn't really.
I went through it. That's a really important point. The question of nature was raised. The most ridiculous thing about this society, and they talk about environment, is we talk about nature reserves. You only have to say it. Nature reserves, separated from everything else. I mean, I just think that's a completely ridiculous term. Even in environmental terms, it doesn't make any sense. We want to break that down. There's a very important point about, could we build socialism in a post-disaster situation with global warming and so on? Well, I think the way to look at it now is, look, we're in the middle of a disaster now, with millions of people already dead, and millions more will die, billions living in fear and now poverty. And yet, even in this disaster, actually, it's relatively easy to see a way out of it. But the way out for the Tories and their likes is to keep the profits going and to see a purely technological way out of it. Now, I'm in favour of the vaccine, but a vaccine on itself is not going to cure it, so long as we keep driving in to the natural landscapes and upsetting the link with nature, and having more zoonism that transfer diseases from animals to humans. It's not going to solve the question. We're just going to have more pandemics. Human nature, I thought it was a brilliant point about that the comrade made about Lord of the Flies. Really interesting. But there's so much of that. Do nurses, teachers, or anyone of that ilk go to work just for the money because they enjoy it? I don't think so. Absolutely not. And when I was really moved when Deb spoke, because I can imagine, Deb, you do a really tough job, which will be appreciated by loads of people, and you're just treated appallingly. And this is built into the whole care home industry, isn't it? Care homes are there for big companies to make profit, not to look after old people. Mike Davis in the United States talks about care homes being warehouses for the elderly, where even army veterans who fought in places like Vietnam die in their hundreds and thousands because the profit motive. Again, something that should be easy to do, care for old people well, which ordinary workers and ordinary people know how to do, know how we could do it, is distorted by the motivation of profit. Let me finish like this, Sloan. I think all things are possible so long as we don't know our place. And the challenge of teachers that Hugh talked about was really important because it's a fantastic victory. It shows how ordinary people can begin to control what happens to us during this pandemic. And it's not the only example, and it's something that we should infuse through society. I'll finish with an example from people will be familiar with Burston. When they opened up the strike school in 1917, there was a march from the railway station to the new strike school, built with trade union donations. And a line of banners and so on went past the local vicar, and so did the young children who walked past the vicar. The vicar was a pillar of the establishment, and according to accounts, he looked pale and sallow. He'd been brought down to earth by the power of the ordinary people in that village. And as the children went by him, they booed and hooted. They turned the world upside down. If we develop that sort of confidence from the sort of thing that the teachers did and Deb talked about doing in her own workplace, then everything, comrades, is possible.